I heard Father Tony O'Riordan speaking about what had happened, and he spoke on Morning Ireland, and I'm sure in other places you have heard him, and he spoke in very memorable terms, both about the gravity of the situation, but also the response that he and others were trying to mount on the ground. Many of you will have heard him talking about the need for psychology and counselling for people already so traumatised and facing other traumas, and then the practical needs around food and shelter. And I was struck by Tony's own comment. I think he was 400 kilometres away when the earthquake happened, and he spoke about just trying to survive the cold. And even getting the basics like a hot water bottle isn't simple when there isn't water, or indeed the heating of water. So things that we take for granted so much suddenly become basic unmet needs for others, and it's happening all over our world. But as I said, the response of people like the Jesuits, Father Tony and many others, who really act on our behalf, because we can't all be out there on the ground, so it behoves us then to support them in the situation they're in, because they're fighting this war against want on our behalf. And they're doing so in particular with the Jesuit spirit of being people for others. You know, that respect for human dignity, because they are people for others. I think men for others was the famous phrase. Was it of St. Ignatius? Or was it one of the more recent heroes of the Jesuit order? So we can give thanks that we have representatives in that great Irish missionary and voluntary tradition, religious and lay, acting on our behalf. But, you know, I'm also thankful to people like you who respond quickly and with alacrity when you get an ask for help, because there are many demands on your time and on your generosity. And I suppose, try and use my job in here to organise events from time to time, because I suppose in politics you do tend to have a contact list, and of course you have a beautiful house that you can show people, and thankfully you don't have to pay for the upkeep of. So one of the things I have tried to do in recent years is to get people in here generally supporting causes. We started an event called the Human Dignity Award in recent years. We've presented that 6 times now, and we generally do it in connection with a fundraiser then for the charity associated with the person that we've honoured. So people like Magnus McFarlane Barrow, the founder of Mary's Meals, was a recipient. The famous late Barney Curley, if any of your gamblers or fans of horse racing, did wonderful work for schools and hospitals in Africa during his life, and we honoured him. And those are occasions that, most recently, Ronan Scully of Self-Help Africa. So many people, so many heroes in that great Irish tradition doing good work. And as I've said, in addition then to being grateful to our representatives on the ground and to you for supporting, as I said, I'm grateful to the people of Leinster House who make all of these things happen, and happen so successfully, and on this occasion at very short notice. So what I plan to do now, I'll say a few words about the giving aspect of this when Tony has finished, but it gives me great pleasure now to turn to Father Tony to ask him to address you. I know him for a long time. We were in UCG together, and even back then Father Tony was organising events in solidarity with people in want. I can remember gathering money for, I think, the Kurds at one stage on Shop Street in Galway, because Tony had, I suppose, what my mother would call the gumption to get up and organise things for others. So he's been a great friend to me over the years, and I and many other of his colleagues and other friends admire him for the work that he's done. But he'd be the first to say that he's just the man in the spot. We all have a role to play here according to the gifts and talents that we have been given. So Tony, delighted to have you here. Maybe you would address us for a few moments and tell us why we're here today in words maybe that are more effective than mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Mullen. Thank you for organising this event, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for the team in Leinster House as well for welcoming us and providing us with the breakfast. I saw this banner as I came into the room. I don't know if at the back of the room whether you can see it, but it's basically a picture of some children sitting on the ground, and there is a stone building behind them. And I actually recognise these children. They live in eastern Aleppo, in an area called Al-Sahur. And you can't really see it from here, but trust me, The building that they are sitting in front of, during the height of the all-out war in Syria and the kind of the factional nature of that war, that building was used as a prison by an affiliate of ISIS. And the building still has a little trace of the poster that that ISIS group posted where they were imposing their rules on the people and the punishments. It lists the way you are to dress, it lists the way you are to go to the mosque, and it listed the associated punishments. And this building was used for detention and torture of many people. Today, gladly, we are using that building as a health centre, providing gynecological and paediatric services to women and children who would not otherwise get access to those kind of services. And I really like that transition of a building that was used for torture and degradation, and now it's being used for life and for well-being. So I was really glad to see that picture here this morning. It's also a reminder, I guess, that in Syria they are just going into the 13th year of dealing with the most brutal of civil wars. And we know in so many countries and around the world, the world is a very broken place and very fragmented at the moment. I think Pope Francis talks about we're in the middle of the Third World War. We haven't maybe named it. And Syria is one of the brutal faces of this broken world. So for 13 years, men, women and children have been dying in Syria. The country is immensely fragmented. Some of it is controlled by the Assad regime. Some of it is occupied by Israel. Some of it is occupied by Turkey. Some of it is occupied and controlled by the so-called rebel forces. And some of it is occupied by the United States and the Kurdish people. So it's compared to what Syria was like 13 years ago, it is unrecognizable as a political entity. Thankfully, the conflict is not as generalized as it was in the height of the years of 2011 to about 2016. There are times where hostilities and bombing and all-out war breaks out, but it tends to be localized. The way the war is impacting on people today is the bomb of poverty. Wide-scale, crippling, grinding, progressive poverty, where people are, the gap between what they have and what they need continues to widen. So when I arrived in Syria, for example, a euro was worth about 2,500 Syrian pounds. Today, 1 euro is worth 7,500 Syrian pounds. So the average income of a person might be the equivalent of 20 euros a month now. If you had to buy bread, it will cost you about $35 a month just for bread. Then add the other things that you need to eat, add the other things you need if you have to pay rent, if you have to pay to try and find some way of heating your house, if someone in your house gets sick. So there is this immense generalized sense where 90% of the population just do not have enough access to income to live not only with dignity, but to live in a very basic way. Add on top of the war and this generalized poverty, believe it or not, COVID had a huge impact in Syria. It further impacted the economy, and it impacted people's sense of well-being. Add to that a recent cholera outbreak. And then, just over 2 months ago, this deadly and devastating earthquake that has killed, the official figure in the region of Turkey and Syria is almost 60,000 people killed in an instant. And it has left 8 million people displaced, having to to leave their home and area. So this is a tragedy on top of tragedy, as Ronan has mentioned. I was in my bed in Damascus, about over 500 kilometers away in the morning. It was 4:30 in the morning, and my bed began to shake enough to wake me. Knew what it was, and I went back to sleep after the minute or so when it was all over. It was only a few minutes later, as my phone began to ping with messages, that I began to get a sense of how serious this event was in Aleppo. Unfolding in Aleppo, I will tell you the story of Faraj, a very good friend of mine who lives with his wife Carol and 2 children. He was in his bedroom and they had no electricity, as most people in Aleppo have no electricity. So in the dark, it was a rainy, very cold night. Suddenly woken, not just the bed shaking, but this grinding sound coming from the earth. Seeing in the silhouette the walls of the bedroom cracking, feeling things falling all over the house, his 2 daughters screaming, calling them, telling them all go into the bed together, and they actually thought they were going to die. And this was replicated across Aleppo and northern Syria, where in the depths of night, this sudden, horrific, frightening event, people just thought this is their last moment. Faraj tells the story that then it stopped and he gave orders to his wife, and the wife had said to him afterwards, "You're treating me now like I'm one of your staff. I'm your wife." But he took command. He said, "Put on your shoes, get your jacket, get your phones, and get out of the house." And his wife and daughters did as they were ordered, and he came down and he discovered he had come down in his slippers, without his jacket and without his phone. So he had got others to do, but he hadn't followed himself. But this is the situation of Faraj and his family is common, where they had this terrifying experience. They went out to a city that was also now out in the street in the early hours of the morning and in the cold and the rain. Several tremors followed, and people did not know when, how serious a tremor would be. All through the morning, and then at lunchtime there was a very, very significant earthquake, measuring again 7.5 on the Richter scale, causing further damage. And all that afternoon, some further aftershocks, and people not knowing what was happening. They had no experience of an earthquake before. They had lived through some deadly moments, but not an earthquake. The government and the authorities and churches and mosques opened to welcome people and receive people, and over 200 shelters were opened within a few hours, and many people began to come to the shelters or are sleeping out. One of the features was that people were not only having lost their lives and lost their buildings, but they had lived through this amazing trauma. I remember talking to one of the community leaders in Sahur, and he spent 6 hours talking to some relatives of his who were buried under the rubble. He could talk to them and hear them, but he couldn't reach them. And for 6 hours he tried, and they were trying to remove the rubble, and then the voices stopped. How agonizing is that sort of way to be with your relative as they're dying? So, apart from losing buildings, apart from losing lives, people lost the sense of safety. People will tell me that during the war, even as missiles and bombs were raining down, they had a sense of safe space. They kind of knew, okay, that area of the city, or if I get to the basement, I can feel pretty safe. It's a reasonable thing to say that I will be safe. In the earthquake, it was like a weapon of mass destruction. The entire city was affected. The entire city felt unsafe. Everyone felt unsafe. So when I arrived in Aleppo, I could see people who I had got to know over the last 2 years, who were very confident and jovial and very positive. They were shattered. So one of the first things I realized that we needed to do, first of all with the team, that I work with in JRS was we needed to look after them. The morning I met them, the night before, over 75% of them had slept in somewhere other than their home, over half of them out in the open. So how could they respond to the needs of the people affected unless we looked after them? And this is true of so many of the other organisations. The people they're relying on to respond are themselves the first victims. So we need to look after the teams that we are relying on to deliver the aid so that they can be strong. So looking after their material needs and their psychological needs, and I said, okay, has to be part of our response generally. If our team are affected, this is one of the ways the whole city and the region are affected. It's not just a physical impact, it's a psychological and a traumatic impact. We also began to see that people do have physical needs, so we decided one of the things we would do in response would be to respond in tandem with psychological needs, but also psychology and spirits have bodies, and bodies need food, and this was one of the major needs. So thanks to the support of good people like you and other people around Ireland and other countries that JRS works with, we've been able to just complete a wave of food distribution to 55,000 people, which I'm quite proud of, that we've been able to do that as a small organisation. And it's quite a feat to feed 55,000 people, to give them enough food to support their food need for at least 1 month. And we're now in the process of beginning to relaunch the second wave of that, where we will hit 40,000 of the most severely affected. So we've also been able, as part of that distribution and identifying families, to invite people to come to psychological first aid sessions, where they get a chance to tell a little bit of their story and listen to each other. And we have about 7,000 people who have participated in these storytelling sessions. And we've continued to our work with and expanded our work in health. So in the last now 9 weeks, we've had 15,000 men, women and children access primary health care. In an earthquake, people are still sick. They get new illnesses, dust inhalation, respiratory illnesses because of sleeping out in the cold. But they also have the routine things like cancer. They get tummy aches. People get sick. And in Syria, if you get sick, unless you have organisations like us, you will not get access to a doctor, or you will not be able to afford the medicine that you need. So it's been great to be, again, supported on the ground by people like you, to be able to give people this sort of basic medical care. We have helped, we reckon, about 75,000 people now with all our services. And we have just listened to the people that we have helped a month and 6 weeks on. And it's good to hear that almost 90% of them are saying that their sense of safety and their sense of well-being is better than it was in the days after the earthquake. I don't think we can claim all the credit for that. People are just naturally resilient, but I do think by relieving the stress of having to worry about food, giving them the opportunity to talk to each other and talk to us and our trained counsellors, and to be able to access medical care, this has been a big part of their recovery. So 90% are recovering really well. There's the 10% who, as I say, have borne nearly 13 years of immense trauma, and for many of those this has just been a little bit too much, that they need further focused intervention, and this is where our focus is now, in identifying and working with those people so that they can be resilient. Because in cases here we're talking about maybe the mother of the household, and unless we can get support to her, it's going to impact on the children and the household. So if we can keep the mother strong, we can keep the family strong. So this will be our next major, and we're beginning to roll this scheme of focused psychological work out. One of our youngest, so we've helped about, like I say, 70,000 people. One of our youngest, the morning of the earthquake, he was still unborn. His mother was eight months pregnant, and the building that she was in, with her two young children, and she also had the care of her two younger brothers. So this woman was pregnant and she had the care of 4 other children. Her building collapsed. Some of her neighbours died. She was heavily traumatized, you can imagine. And she went with another family who lived in the building, and their strategy was, let's get out of Aleppo, let's move to Damascus. And our team in Damascus came across them in an unfurnished room that resembled more a utility room than a place for human habitation, but this is what they could get. And they were without food. She was quite malnourished. She was in need of medical care. So we tried to respond to all of these needs, and the priority was her health. And we discovered that she needed hospitalization. And then 2 weeks later, this wonderful baby Zayn was born. So he's our youngest person to benefit from JRS support and from the support of people like you. He was born, he was just over 1 kilo. And he's going up and down. I was just checking in with him earlier this morning, the family. So he's not doing so well. There's issues of kind of digestion, and I'm not a doctor, I don't understand, but I understand he's not well and he needs more support. But also his mother needs support in that family. And we have been able to help them get better accommodation, to help the children come into our education program, and to ensure that that family have food, that the mother has access to medical care, and that she has a chance to begin to process what she has been through and what has happened to her. So this is, I kind of wonder, so baby Zayn, God willing, he will survive. What sort of a world will he grow up in? What kind of a Syria will he inherit? Huh? And what kind of a Syria will he contribute to? And I want to remain hopeful, but it's very, very difficult to see hope for Syria right now. The hope is incremental, and I think the hope has to be held for Syria by people outside of Syria. So I have been saying to people who have been so good in giving us support these days, I'm so grateful for that support, but I also want your memory. I want you to remember Syria, to remember, because before the earthquake, the situation of people in Syria was largely forgotten. It's not an area that draws the attention too much of the West anymore, but the suffering there is immense. And if you're to analyse how that suffering has come about, there is complicity of Western countries and governments in the role that we have played and continue to play through the implementation of a sanctions regime that perhaps has no end game. So we need maybe, as well as fundraising, friend-raising. And it's so wonderful that you have come here, and I see your friendly faces this morning. I'm hoping with your help we can continue to help the baby Zayn and the many baby Zayns and his family and his friends in not only the weeks ahead, but I think months and years ahead. So thank you so much, Goramil Malguf, and I will hand you back to Ronan, who I think will, let me finish on a joke of the priest who stood up, and the congregation were kind of aware that there was problems with the roof of the church. And he said, yes, I have good news and I have bad news. You all know that the roof of the church needs replacing. It's a very big job. The roof has to be replaced. The good news is we have the money to do it. The bad news is the money is in your pocket. Senator Mullens will talk about the task of getting the money from your pocket towards our party. Thank you very much.